Hello and welcome back to another video tutorial session. This video tutorial session is titled Session 3, and this session will focus on Freud's theories around psychoanalysis, the power of the unconscious, and self-awareness. I will also be responding to the feedback that you provided on ECI, and this was particularly the feedback given on the Freudian Wiki that I provided that linked to the additional reading on the ECI page. Many of you provided some very insightful overview and discussion in this particular wiki, but what many of you failed to do was update the actual overview or general discussion part. You just added comments. So please go back and relook to see if you've just added comments on this, and take the pointers or discussions that you put in the comments and transfer this to the overall general discussion portion of this activity. For those of you who are unsure or unaware of what I am referring to, firstly, a wiki is a collaborative space where users can update, modify, and edit information on any particular topic. And I've created a wiki on the ECI page surrounding Freud and his theory of the iceberg metaphor or iceberg analogy. This process is very much like Wikipedia, which is obviously a very well-known wiki, so anybody from all over the globe can edit and modify information on this particular site. So for those of you who have not contributed to this, please go look and see what your peers or colleagues have already contributed and see what you can already add to this discussion. After this session, perhaps you might think of new points that you'd like to add. Please feel free to do so. Please be reminded that this space is really a space for us to build on one another's overview and perception, and to build on one another's understanding. So please do not be offended if somebody edits or modifies your work. That is the purpose and intention of a wiki. We learn from one another and we improve on one another's strengths. For this particular slide, we will be providing a brief introduction to Freudian therapy and focusing particularly on his talk therapy. We will not be focusing on hypnosis, although if you would like to read up further around that, there is a correlation to hypnosis and the unconscious part of the mind, as some of you mentioned in your observation in the wiki. For this particular discussion point, we are going to be focusing on how Freud's therapy and his approach to therapy was all about bringing the unconscious domain to the light. there was this whole understanding that if the unconscious were to be made conscious, so the person is aware of where their issues or problems are rooted in, and they are able to understand why they are behaving in sometimes very abnormal ways, then they will be able to come to a point of self-awareness. They will be able to accept parts of themselves, and they will be able to implement coping strategies or solutions to overcome particular issues or problems that they face. And please, at this point, I want you to come back to that visual depiction of this theory. And the visual depiction is, of course, the iceberg analogy or iceberg metaphor. This particular metaphor describes the conscious part of the mind as being the minority, but the majority, the bulk of the mind, is actually the unconscious material, that material or that domain that is below the surface of the water. This is the part that, according to Freud, controlled our behavior, our psyche, and our personality. So in order to understand a person, in order to understand their issues, we really needed to get insight into the unconscious. So many of his techniques was all about revealing what was actually going on in the unconscious. So how Freud achieved this revelation of what was going on in the unconscious was through his talk therapeutic strategies. So for many of us, when we think of psychology, the picture that generally comes up is of this patient on the couch scenario. And this is a visual depiction of talk therapy in action. What you can see on the right-hand side here is the client or patient lying on the couch, and then there is the therapist who is sitting there taking down notes about what the client is saying. According to this therapeutic approach, the more a person spoke through the issues, the more they were able to process and unpack them. And in the talking and unburdening of the soul, the individual will slowly get to a stage of self-awareness. This often does take years. It is a very extensive therapeutic process. But in a nutshell, really what Freud was doing, and what many therapists still do, is this whole idea of making the client feel comfortable. So that's where a lot of the times the client would be expected to lie on a couch. There is something about that makes a person feel comfortable, and when a person feels comfortable, they are more likely to speak about what is really going on. And the therapist is basically there to help the client get a sense of understanding about what might be going on at that unconscious level. And also, this is where that age-old question, and from many movies that you've watched, the very cliched therapist's response is always, how did that make you feel? And that whole idea is a description of talk therapy in a nutshell. The whole idea is that the client talks through issues, and the therapist is just there asking probing questions. So during these talk therapy situations, there would be many techniques that a Freudian theorist would use. One such approach is free association. So Freud believed that free association reveals information that is dormant in the unconscious. So when you are thinking of this unconscious mind, I a lot of the times like to equate it or think about it like a volcano. A volcano can erupt at any point. It remains dormant or alive. So in a sense, a volcano is basically asleep, but it is not dead. It is still alive. It still has energy. And that is very much like the unconscious mind. So Freud believed that in order to tap into this unconscious, it's all about encouraging the person to talk through things. And one such technique he used was this idea of what comes to mind when I say this word. And basically when he would say that or state that, whatever you first said would reveal what is really going on. So say, for instance, if I said to you, when I say the word nighttime. What do you equate that with? Or what do you relate this to? For some of us, we might say the word exciting, freedom, fun. Then I would say that this reveals that your unconscious, there's obviously something positive attached to this. However, for some of you, if you might say ominous, scary, frightening, that may suggest that perhaps did something happen to you in the nighttime? Why would that be the first thing that you said? Why would that come to your mind first? And whatever you said would reveal what is really going on in the unconscious, what you really feel about this particular term. And linking quite closely to freedom of association is Freudian slips and slips of the tongue. So Freud believed that when we had these slips of the tongue, whatever we said in the heat of the moment was actually what we truly believed. It was actually our unconscious basically taking over our conscious mind. So many people who have these Freudian slip moments would say things like, immediately, I didn't really mean to say that, but Freud would argue that in fact we did mean to say that, and that's where our unconscious domain is really coming to the surface. So he believed these kind of statements, what we said in the heat of the moment, represented what we were repressing in our unconscious mind. And that is why a lot of the times when people get into fights, and particularly couples get into fights, they say things in the heat of the moment and they feel very guilty about it. A lot of the times those are things that they actually truly feel, but they may be too fearful to actually verbalize it. But that whole slip of the tongue would be, let's unpack why did you say this, and how you said something would be very important for the therapist to unpack and explore. Final strategy that we're going to be discussing is dream analysis, but I just want to keep coming back to this point of each one of these therapeutic approaches that Freud undertook was all about trying to tap into the unconscious, trying to unpack what a client or patient might mean when they say specific things, and how these things actually represent what is going on in this unconscious part of the mind. What he also believed is that when this unconscious material came into the conscious part of the mind, there would be this release of energy, what he a lot of the time referred to as catharsis. So a lot of the times when people are bottling things up, they feel a sense of paranoia, a sense of anxiety. It takes a lot of energy and it depletes your energy to keep these things in. So in this therapeutic environment, this therapeutic space where you were sharing your opinions, your feelings, your deepest, darkest fears, all the rest of it, there was actually a sense that you were truly unburdening the soul and you felt lighter afterwards. This is why a lot of the times when we do share our issues with somebody, it's very important that we do this because it makes us feel lighter. This whole idea of a problem shared is a problem halved. But why it's very good to seek out a counselor or therapist is that they are then bound, obviously, by confidentiality to keep this within a confidential space. So be very mindful, obviously, who you unburden your soul to, but it's very important to have people to talk to around what we might be feeling particularly fearful or anxious about. The final technique that we're going to be discussing is dream analysis. And this one was very revolutionary and still is very revolutionary and was basically a cornerstone to Freud's theory. This whole idea that dreams we have are symbolic representation of what is actually going on in the unconscious mind. So in a very real sense, what Freud believed is when we were asleep, obviously our conscious mind is then asleep, and that's really where the unconscious mind can play around. The unconscious mind then comes to the forefront, and things that are bothering us are explored in a very symbolic manner. That is why Freud argued that dreams were a connection to the unconscious self. He actually argued, and this is his famous quote, that dreams were the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. So in his therapeutic sessions, he would often unpack the symbolic nature of a person's dream. He would focus on recurring dreams that people would have and encourage people to think about what they thought the dream meant, what they thought the dream symbolized. And as much as many of us might not have access to therapists and some therapists might not focus on the dreams that you have, I think it's very important for us in our journey towards self-awareness to be self-reflective about the dreams that we have and to be conscious and mindful of the fact that when we do have these recurring dreams or when we do dream something that's very vivid in our mind, it is really our unconscious trying to communicate something to our conscious self. So I always say it's a very good idea to keep track of your dreams, maybe keep a dream journal, and try to get a sense of what is really going on in your life. Your unconscious mind is trying to convey and communicate something, and it's up to us to reflect and unpack what that might be. I think particularly in this time, due to the coronavirus pandemic, many of us might be having very vivid, very anxious dreams. And I really want to encourage you to keep a journal, keep notes down, and see what the patterns are, see what the recurring themes are. This is your unconscious trying to communicate something, and you can then take steps on a conscious level to help relax your mind or to put things in place that might be causing you unnecessary anxiety and worry. Obviously, this is something that I would encourage you to do, whether you feel comfortable in doing it. But coming back to Freud, very important that we look at this dream analysis, this exploration of the dreams as being a milestone in psychological therapy and is a very crucial component to everybody in their level of self-awareness. So this slide is going to explore the different dynamics of the mind and what governs and controls our behavior according to Freud's theory. So Freud believed that we had different parts of the psyche that were controlled by different forces. These different parts were referred to as the id, the ego, and the superego. So essentially what the ego is our complete personality, and it's the go-between the superego and the id. What I mean by this is that behavior, our ego, who we are, our psyche, our personality, is determined by the struggle between unconscious primitive impulses made up of the id. If you look at the picture on the right-hand side, the id is shown as the devil on the one shoulder that controls us, that whispers in our ear. And then on the other side, the other shoulder, we have the superego, which is depicted by the angel on the other shoulder. And this tries to oppose the id, and it works at keeping this threatening material, this uncontrollable urges and drives that we have, out of the conscious realm of awareness. So Freud would argue that a lot of people who say that their behavior is not governed or controlled by these specific impulses that are sexual and aggressive in nature are in denial, and they are not aware that this is what underlies behavior because it is in the unconscious realm. They are not quite conscious of it. And I think people get quite uncomfortable with this. But if you think of a lot of the times goals that people have, it's all about their relationship. Many people want to get married, they want to have a family, and part of that is driven by this sexual impulse that we have. Everybody has this need for connection. They have a need to, a lot of the times, have children. Not everybody, but most people have these kind of wants and goals. And that is really where the superego comes in. So the superego can be seen as a moral compass. It can be seen basically as social influences and morality. So it's this whole idea that the superego would say, marriage is the ideal that we should strive towards, and the id underlies this kind of behavior. So here is where the ego is the go-between. So we have these drives, things that drive our behavior. Then behavior is a lot of the times motivated by moral standing. So say, for instance, for a lot of people, they want to get married as they want to have children, and they want to pass on their knowledge to the next generation. And we see this go-between in the ego. And as a final sort of closing comment on this, I think the aggressive impulse or drive is also a very interesting thing. A lot of the times this is controlled by society. Obviously, there are laws that control this release of aggression. But what's been really interesting to see in these times is how people, when they are very scared, they a lot of the times act very aggressively. This impulse comes out quite strongly. And I think that is where there's been a lot of jest and laughter over people fighting over toilet paper. But what we really see in those videos that have done their sort of rounds on social media is that the aggressive drive comes to the forefront. The person's unconscious basically takes over, and they essentially lose the plot. And that is governed by the fact that they are scared. So as much as these things are really, when we see these things happening around us, psychology is always there to best explain it. This theory often rubs people up the wrong way because I think people are very uncomfortable with the fact that their behavior is governed completely by these internal forces. People often like to say that they themselves are in control of their own destiny, and if this is what you're feeling, then I think you are more aligned to a humanistic perspective. So it's important for us to always look at the shortcomings of theories, but to take a step back and see the arguments. So there is definitely a lot of arguments. As human beings, we are a lot of the times driven by these impulses, but society seeks to curb them or to control them in socially appropriate ways. So I think what's also really interesting is even if we look at human society and how we have evolved, people might say, yes, we've evolved, we now value human life more, people are not entertained by gladiator games where people are fighting to the death and they see that as entertainment. But in actual fact, I think if we look at TV series and movies that are very popular, a lot of the times we find that they are exceptionally violent. So it's almost as if society has given a platform for people to release this aggression that they have inside them. Either way, whether we agree or disagree, and people often do, it's really interesting to note that the psyche or the ego is determined by various forces. That is the sort of dynamics and the struggle between this conscious and unconscious part of the mind. So it's okay to disagree, but please, like I've already said, take a step back and try and interrogate it. And finally, this is just another visual description of the id, the ego, and the superego, and how there is this dynamic process and how behavior is determined. The id is definitely made up of these impulses, these physiological needs that we have, and the superego seeks to control it. The ego, like we can see here, is the judge. It is the go-between. And in order for us to understand why people behave in a specific manner, we need to look at all parts of the psyche, all parts of the personality. And I think in these unprecedented times that we find ourselves in, we really see what motivates human behavior and how human beings can be. And I think it's not to say that we sometimes condone this terrible behavior, but as educators and as psychology students, it's always good to understand behavior, to sometimes take a step back, not necessarily judge behavior, but maybe look at, well, what is likely to shape this behavior? Take a step back from judging and look at it as an objective outsider. From an educated perspective, let's understand what shapes and affects behavior. And for Freud and his theory of psychodynamic and psychoanalysis, it was all about the unconscious part of the mind. And I think that no matter what we feel about Freud, a lot of us can agree that his findings and discussions around this unconscious part of the mind were very important contributions to psychology, and it's very important contributions for us ourselves. In order to become self-aware, it's very important for us to unpack and reflect on what might be going on below the surface of the water, if we are looking back at that iceberg analogy. So I want you to always keep thinking of these questions, these techniques, and particularly with the dream analysis, to always come back to what is your unconscious communicating to you. Thank you for your time in listening to this video. I hope it wasn't too circular. But please, after you've discussed this, if you do further reading, please go back to the wiki and share and develop on one another's responses.